So what are user stories? When I ask students this question, I get a lot of varying answers. Some would say things like their requirements, their features, tasks, items in the product backlog. Well, the textbook definition for user stories is a little bit weird, but here it is. It's an invitation to a conversation. See, weird. What that really means is that a user story is, regardless of its content, designed to spark a conversation. For reasons that'll become clear shortly. I need to tell you that user stories do not come from Scrum. They were a tool designed by a different Agile framework called extreme programming. And the reason why extreme programming designed this tool that we call user stories will become clear momentarily. Even though Scrum didn't create the tool that we call user stories, they fit nicely into Scrum as one type of product backlog item, one type of PBI. Other than user stories, what else can we have in the product backlog? Well, according to the Scrum Guide, here it is. Features, functions, requirements, enhancements, and fixes. All of those things can be in there, and sometimes they take the shape of bugs or tasks or epics. All these things are commingled in the product backlog with user stories, and the product owner has the unfortunate job of having to prioritize all of those things in the product backlog, not just the user stories. When the folks at Extreme Programming were designing this tool that we call user stories, they had three things top of mind. They all happen to start with the letter C. Those three things are a card, a conversation, and confirmation. I'll explain all of these and the significance now. So, the card. When this tool was created, we didn't have many of the sophisticated tools that we have now, like Jira and others, to digitally store these items. We used to write them on these little index cards, little 3x5 index cards to be specific. The size of the card was a requirement. We wanted the cards to be small so that we didn't have a chance to write too much detail on these user story cards. So in other words, and this might be an unlearning moment for you, user stories are supposed to intentionally lack detail. Why would we want to intentionally lack detail on whatever we write on this little card? Well, because if it's too detailed, if there's too much language on the card, it might lead us into the false assumption that we don't need to have a conversation about what's written on the card. That would be a mistake. Now, here's how I know that would be a mistake, and this is, I'm sure, what was inspiring the folks at Extreme Programming to create this tool that we call user stories. They saw something happen over and over again in companies. They saw a scenario where, let's say, the business writes a requirements document, something big and thick. They hand it to the developers. The developers then disappear into their cubicles for a couple of months, and they start turning pages of this document and writing code per its instructions. After a couple of months, the developers return to the business and proudly present what they built. And to this, the business would respond, "This is not what we wanted." I'm sure you've encountered this before as well. So, if this were to happen over and over again, the business would now start to form a very unfortunate opinion about their developers. That opinion is they're not competent. They need to be micromanaged. Are they not competent? No, they are extremely competent. So what's the problem here? Why couldn't these simple instructions be followed by those developers? Well, here is the problem. This document that was written by a business person was written in the mindset of business. And that is not typically how developers interpret these documents. Developers have very analytical minds, very logical minds, and very literal minds. It doesn't make them incompetent, it makes them super geniuses at what they do. Whereas the business tends to write these documents figuratively. Developers interpret them literally. So this doesn't mean that either side is incompetent. It just means they think differently. And when you have two or more people who think differently, the only way to come to a shared understanding is through a conversation. So when the extreme programming folks got together to do this, to brainstorm this creation of this tool, their purpose was to get us talking to each other. Now, I've sat with leadership in many occasions and let them know that the purpose of user stories is to get people to have conversations. And leadership would resist that in many cases because they would say, that's going to take forever. Getting people together to talk about every single user story, that's going to take forever. I would argue, okay, yeah, it would likely take a while, but what's going to take longer? Having the conversation or building something over a period of months that you didn't want? What's going to cost more? What's going to take more time? So the conversation is worth having. So the idea is we write something on this card, then we talk about it. And that brings us to our third C, which is confirmation. So the card, the conversation, and confirmation. Once we're at confirmation, now everyone who's invested in this process understands what the user story is actually looking for in terms of an outcome. That conversation, by the way, is going to take place in the world of Scrum inside of backlog refinement. That's when we talk about upcoming work and make sure that everyone understands exactly what we're supposed to be building, so we run a lower risk of building the wrong thing. Once we have confirmation, we can then finalize something called acceptance criteria. Now, acceptance criteria is often confused with definition of done. They are quite different. Here's the difference. Acceptance criteria is how we know a story is done from the user's point of view, whereas definition of done is the standard of quality the development team is following to make sure that whatever we build is built to a super high standard of quality. So when a story is done per the definition of done, it's done from the developer's point of view. They've built it well. I had a coach 100 years ago who had a great way of describing for me the difference between acceptance criteria and definition of done. And here it is. Acceptance criteria helps us build the right thing. Definition of done helps us build the thing right. Here's what a user story looks like. As who, I want what, so that why. Now, if you've ever written a user story before, you may have struggled with it. I have as well. I would struggle with two major points. Number one, I felt like I had to provide more detail. I felt like I was going to be poorly judged if I was unclear. Or perhaps I felt like I needed to help the developers by giving them more clarity, but that just puts us back into this dynamic over again. The other reason I would struggle writing stories is I would worry, is this story that I'm writing too big? Is it too big to fit in a sprint? So I would obsess about those things, and that would cause me to really struggle. But here's the really good news. Those points, the details themselves of how to implement this thing, or the size of the story, they are important, but not yet. At the time that you're writing a user story, those things don't yet matter. When we talk about the story in backlog refinement, we will get to those implementation details, and we will get to the size of the story to figure out if it's too big, and if it is, we split it up. But that's not done by one single person, that's done by the collective, the team, in refinement. When we're writing a story, all we need to know are three things. Who is the user we're creating it for? What is the feature that that user wants? And why does that user care? That's it. If you can do that, you'll write a story that is good in structure and promotes a conversation. How do you know you're writing good stories? There's an acronym called INVEST. This acronym is a good rule of thumb, a guideline for us to write good user stories, and I'll happily explain now what each of these items means. When we say a story is independent, that means the story has its own value. its own use to the user. And that value is not necessarily dependent on other stories. There are likely going to be chronological dependencies that get in our way with stories. That's only logical. For example, if you had one user story to create the walls of a house and a second user story to create the roof of the house, you'd probably want to do the walls first because the roof rests on top of the walls. So therefore, there is a chronological dependency. The story about building the walls has its own value, as does the one for the roof. Negotiable refers to the story being able to be changed while it's still in the product backlog. We can make any changes we need to make to the story while it's still there. However, once the story comes into a sprint, we shouldn't change the story after that point. That creates a moving target for developers, and it leads to massive amounts of product quality issues, technical debt, and lots of morale issues, motivation issues for the team itself. In my CSM and CSPO classes, we do talk about a way to make sure that we don't need to change stories in a sprint, and I'll give you a little clue. It's backlog refinement. If you're doing it well and doing it the way we teach in those classes, you won't need to change a story in a sprint ever again. Now, we're not talking about changing the tasks needed to get to the story being completed. That will often happen, but the story itself shouldn't change. Its acceptance criteria shouldn't change once it all gets into a sprint. Valuable. A story should be valuable from the user's perspective. If the team can't figure out how to estimate a story or how to test a story, it's probably not very clear or well written. And a story would eventually need to be small because it has to be finished in a single sprint. Let's talk about why conversation about the story is so important. Here you have a requirement. It says, I want a big cookie that says, "So long, Alicia," in purple, surrounded by stars. Now, if you picture in your head, just for a moment, what that cookie might look like based on the written description, I'm going to guess that the image you're not coming up with is this. Now, have a look at this picture and ask yourself this question. Does this cookie match the requirements? So think back. I want a big cookie that says, "So long, Alicia," in purple, surrounded by stars. Well, we have a big cookie. It does say "So long, Alicia," in purple in parentheses right here. And it is surrounded by stars. So technically speaking, this cookie meets the written requirements. However, I guarantee you, whoever wrote those requirements, they were not picturing this cookie. Now think about this. If you're a developer, you've looked at the requirements, you've built the cookie. You didn't build it this way to be difficult. You built it this way because that's what you understood was wanted. You invested yourself in the work. You're proud of the results because it meets the exact requirements. You feel good, you feel accomplished, you feel like you did what you were told, and you've added value. You present this cookie to the business, and they're upset. They're angry at you. They think you're a moron because you developed exactly what was written, but not what was wanted. Okay? If you had had a conversation, here's some of the things you might have seen. When a developer says, okay, based on the specs, what color do you want in purple in parentheses to be on the top of the cookie? That's the kind of question that might indicate we have a lack of understanding here. Now the product owner can say, oh, no. We don't want you to write in purple. We want "So long, Alicia" to be in purple color. Oh, ding, clarity. Okay. Now, stars, what color do you want the letters to be in the word stars? Oh, we don't want it to say the word stars. We want the symbol stars, and we'd like gold. Ah, thank you. Okay, so now this might feel like a rudimentary example, but this is precisely how developers think versus how business people write. You might hear business people say, "You know what I mean," whereas you'll hear developers say, "I know what you wrote." So neither side is incompetent. They just think differently. Here's another example. I want a vehicle with 4 wheels, a steering wheel, an engine, and a comfortable seat. Now, when I read that requirement, what immediately conjures to mind for me is this beautiful S-Class Mercedes, thank you very much, you bet. However, it would be safe to say potentially that this also meets those requirements. Thus, we need a conversation about the story. The biggest reason? To make sure we don't build the wrong thing. Why? That costs money, and lots of it. Now, based on what you know about user stories so far, I'm going to give you a second to check this one out. It says, as a Netflix member, I want to search for movie titles by keyword so I can see my viewing options. We would actually say that this is a good story. The reason? We know who the user is, we know what the user wants, we know why they care, and we could have a conversation to unpack some details. That's a good story. This next one, slightly different. As a Netflix member, I want to search for movie titles by keyword and genre and rating so I can see my viewing options. Good or bad? The answer on this one is actually a little bit surprising. It depends. And here's what it depends on: the team that's looking at it. So there's something different about the I want line in this story. We have a conjunction, the word and, showing up twice. Now, what this tells us is that potentially this story could be split along the lines of those conjunctions, and, or but, if you see them in your I want line. This could actually become 3 stories. I want to search for movie titles by keyword. That could be story 1. And genre. Genre could be story 2, and rating could be story 3, potentially. The reason it depends is because what if you've got a team that's been together for a long time? They are extremely familiar with the platform. Maybe they've been together for a couple of years. They built the entire platform. They're very familiar with the logic, the architecture, the code. They may say to you, it's actually easier to keep this as a single story because to them, the work is no more challenging. If you have a team, however, that just formed, maybe a member or 2 of the team are brand new hires to the company, and none of them have ever worked in this platform before, they might say, I think we should split this up and de-risk it a little bit. So for them, this would not be a great story. Our third example is an example that I used to write when I was a product owner. As a Netflix member, I want to search for movie titles by keyword. This should use a stored procedure rather than inline SQL for the query so the system runs faster. The system shall, I love those words, the system shall also use client-side validation rather than server-side, so errors are immediately shown to the user so I can see my viewing options. This is not a bad story. This is a horrible story. This story is absolutely terrible, and the reason, it's getting into the how. A user story is meant to give us what is to be built, not how to build it. We trust developers to figure out the how. Acceptance criteria. As we said, that is how a user knows the story is done. So if we take the story here that we said was good, as a Netflix member, I want to search for movie titles by keyword so I can see my viewing options. We're going to break this down. We're going to talk about acceptance criteria here, but there's a couple of things I want to mention first. When we're doing this, we confine the discussion to just this story. So in other words, one of the things we would not say as acceptance criteria here is, I can log in. Logging in is not handled in this story. It cannot be an acceptance criteria of this story. Okay, so we want to confine it to just this story. The other thing is the I want line is the feature that we're trying to validate with the story itself. So if we're going to successfully come up with acceptance criteria, we've got to put ourselves in the position of the Netflix member in this case. So if we think about it, this is about a search tool. We need a keyword, enter a keyword, conduct a search, see results. How's the user going to know that this story is done? Well, the first thing the user is going to need to be able to do is locate something. And that thing is the search bar. So I can locate a search bar. Okay, that would be the first thing our user would need to be able to do to validate this story. Once they have found the search bar, I can enter a keyword into that search bar. Okay, so far I've found a search bar, I've entered a keyword. Next thing the user is going to be able to do, I can execute a search. Okay, probably by pressing an enter button or on the keyboard or a button on the screen. And then finally, as that user, once again, I can see results that match the keyword I entered. That would be how a user is going to know that this story is done, those 4 items. We did not hear things or see things in here like the code has been unit tested, the display is cross-browser compatible, the design is responsive for different mobile interfaces, the code was regression tested, and so forth. These are things that would be candidates for our definition of done. Whereas in this case, the acceptance criteria is specific to the individual user story and how the user would know it's done. That concludes our lesson on user stories. Don't forget to take the quiz at the end of this course. It'll test your knowledge on what you just retained and help you write awesome user stories.